I worked for the UN for a while, like indirectly, and I wasn't paid for it, by the way. It was volunteer work. I worked on this document, which was the report to the Secretary General on Sustainable Economic Development. It's quite funny because a lot of the right-wing conspiracy theorists are having a field day with that, man, that I'm some sort of like closet globalist shill because I work momentarily for the UN. It's like, well, what the hell are you supposed to do when you're asked to do something like that? You know, there was a document that was being prepared that was supposed to lay out some halfways intelligent vision of what things might be like if the international community cooperated for the next 30 years. It wasn't like there weren't brutal guidelines that were going to be enforced by jackbooted Nazis. It was just a proposal paper, and so we had a chance to work on it. There was only one Canadian team, and I got placed on that, and that was kind of cool. And so it gave me an opportunity to spend 2 years reading about economics and about ecology at the same time. And what was so weird about that was the more I read, the more optimistic I got. And I thought, well, that isn't what I expected. Like, I thought we were going to hell in a handbasket at quite the rapid rate. And, you know, I mean, there's no doubt that we're doing some stupid things, and I would say the stupidest thing we're probably doing is overfishing the oceans, because there's just no use. There's just no use in that. It's completely destructive. It doesn't do anybody any good, and it could be stopped. But I know that your country, for example, is starting to put aside marine park reserves that are fishery-free, essentially. And you don't need a lot of that before the ocean can regenerate itself, because it's actually pretty good at that. One of the things that's kind of funny, you know, remember when there was that big oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico? You know, there were more fish there 2 years later than there were before the spill? You know why? Because people stopped fishing. So it turned out that the pollution was really good for the fish. It's like, yeah, well, that's why you have to do your research carefully, because you never know, you know, you never know what's true and what isn't. And so that was pretty interesting. The same thing happened in World War II, by the way, in the North Sea, because the North Sea had been fished out pretty badly. And then during World War II, it wasn't all that safe to go out and fish in the North Sea, because, you know, you would get sunk by a submarine, and that was not very bright. So people stopped fishing, and the fish came back very rapidly. And fish do that because they breed quite quickly. And so if you just leave the damn things alone for a while, most of them come back. But you know, apart from the fisheries, which is really quite an appalling and pessimistic story, although not hopeless, and people are waking up to it and building these marine reserve parks, for example. A lot of the ecological news was surprisingly good, way better than I thought it would be. You know, so for example, there are more forests in the Northern Hemisphere than there were 100 years ago. So who would have guessed that? I wouldn't have guessed that. Partly it's because marginal farmland has returned to forest, and because we've got more effective at agriculture by a huge margin. And there are more forests in China than there were 30 years ago. And so that's something. And it turns out when people burn coal, which is, you know, kind of polluting, they don't burn wood. So, you know, they're going to burn something because they don't like eating raw, inedible things and freezing to death. So they're going to burn something. And it turns out that coal is actually preferable to wood. And so these things are complicated. And the ecological story looked better than I would have ever guessed. Even the overpopulation issue, you know, ever since the 1960s with Paul Ehrlich and the population bomb, there was this terrible pessimism that we were going to breed, you know, like uncontrolled rats until every square inch of the world was like covered with some starving skeleton, and that was all going to happen by the year 2000, when there would be mass starvation and the price of commodities would have blown through the roof, when we would run out of oil and all the commodities that we need to maintain a reasonably high standard of living. And, you know, that didn't happen. And not only did it happen, is that rates of poverty went down and rates of hunger went down, even though the population went way up. And so there are more people who are hungry now than there were 50 years ago, but there are far fewer proportion of people who are hungry, and that's really something. And so the overpopulation doom and gloomers were absolutely wrong. Wrong, wrong, wrong. And we're going to peak at 9 billion. That's what it looks like. All the projections indicate something around 9 billion, and that's only 2 billion more than we have. Like, it's not nothing. It's still 2 billion people, but at the rate at which we're improving agricultural output and with regards to efficiency of agricultural output, there's no evidence whatsoever that we're going to run out of food. And, you know, a country like Uganda, this is quite interesting. If Uganda, which is a very big country, by the way, if it was utilized properly, it has a water table underneath it and plenty of water. If Uganda was utilized properly, it could feed all of Africa. And so it's not like we're making full use even of the agricultural capacity that we have available to us. And so we're not going to overpopulate the world and leave everybody like starving on like Easter Island with nothing but giant heads and no trees. That's not going to happen. And in fact, I have a sneaking suspicion that within 100 years, one of the biggest problems that we'll be facing is a declining population, and that'll be worrisome. I mean, we won't be concerned about that at the moment, but that whole doom and gloom scenario just seems to be wrong. And you know, there are fewer wars than there were by a large margin. The overall rates of homicidal behavior in the world have plummeted. The rates of death by terrorism over the last 50 years have plummeted. There's a lot of good news. There's way more good news than there is bad news. And there's no wars in the Western Hemisphere. There's a piece of good news. You know, that's a remarkable thing. So, and it's been 70 years since World War II, and we've had thermonuclear weapons since then, and of course everyone's terrified of those bloody things, and no wonder, and maybe that's for the best, because maybe we needed something to really terrify us, you know. It's certainly possible, but even though there's always the possibility of a mistake, and there's still the possibility of a nuclear outbreak, we haven't used them, and we haven't had a third world war, and almost all of us here have lived in, what you got to think, man, comparative peace and prosperity if you compare it to any other time and place anywhere else in the world at any point in history, which is not perfect because, you know, you're still getting old and you're still going to die, and we haven't defeated all the diseases that beset us, but God, it could be a lot worse, and we seem to be making it a lot better.